Hello Ignition Radio listeners and welcome to Airtime of the Geek. It's Monday and it's 1pm GMT if you're listening via our website or via TuneIn. If you're listening to the 1am repeat, it's 5pm Pacific, 7pm Central and 8pm Eastern. Comments, queries, suggestions, you can follow me on Twitter at AirtimeGeek or you can follow me on Instagram at Airtime of the Geek. We're currently having some problem with our emails, so my email address, paulab@ignitionradio.co.uk, is currently not receiving emails, and we've had some problems with our website, but you can still always listen to us via TuneIn. It's the 7th of March, which means it's only 48 days until Game of Thrones Season 6 airs. So let's play a little song, and then we'll do the Geek News. So it's time for the Geek News. HBO have said that they're not releasing screeners this year for Game of Thrones after last year's 4-episode leak debacle. Some fans still debate as to whether those episodes were leaked on purpose due to the slow pace of those first 4 episodes, but with so much anticipation now we're almost completely off book, they're not letting anything out of the Red Keep for now. The new Star Trek TV show just keeps getting better news as Rod Roddenberry has been added as an executive producer to the show. Given that Gene's son has been heavily involved with fan-funded projects over the years, it's a massive seal of approval. Exciting levels of excitement are off the charts as finally the new trailer for the new Ghostbusters movie was released. I am so excited with this film coming out. I honestly can't wait. I love Melissa McCarthy. I'm loving the whole thing. I cannot wait to watch it. In the biggest understatement of the decade, Christian Bale, in a recent interview, said that he didn't do Batman justice. On the other hand, I think personally he played the part of Steve, the angry hobo who steals the Batcave, perfectly fine. Kevin Smith has realised again that his non-viewer skewerverse movies make no money and has announced his upcoming film projects Mallrats and Clerks 3. I really enjoyed Clerks 2 and it gave the characters a happy ending, so I'm really hoping that Clerks 3 doesn't undo all of that. Apparently, the cancelled Venom spin-off of Amazing Spider-Man is back on. It won't include Spider-Man though, or any mention of him, and that'll be weird. It's kind of like saying you're going to do a spin-off movie of Lex Luthor but not mention Superman or Metropolis or anything to do with Superman. ABC has renewed Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. but not Agent Carter, which means that my giant girl crush on Hayley Atwell will only be assuaged in her other shows when she's playing, well, still awesome people, but none as awesome as Peggy Carter. Agent Carter ended on a high note with Madame Mask defeated and Peggy finding love after Steve, but left us with the mystery in the form of Agent Thompson being killed in true Joss Whedon style in the closing moments, being shot in the chest by a mysterious figure, who we will probably never find out who it was, or if Agent Thompson indeed survived. It's less than 8 weeks until Civil War comes out, in which Tony Stark is betrayed by Steve Rogers for his old boyfriend Bucky Barnes. Me and the rest of the internet are hoping the movie ends with naked hot tub sexy times. So I'm going to play a little song now, and then we're going to do this week's Top 10. That was Don Felder's Heavy Metal from the movie Heavy Metal, which if anyone's seen, it's a completely and utterly bizarre experience, but it's got some really great music. If you'd like to get in contact with the show, you can do so via Twitter. You can follow me at Airtime Geek, or you can follow me on Instagram at Airtime of the Geek. You can also phone into the studio. Our number is 01642 645 827. This week in the Tales of Brave Sir Robin, he started a new D&D group, a spin-off of our original group, so we could get an extra night of gaming in. We start playing tomorrow night, and I'm going to be leading the sessions as Dungeon Master, which is basically just an excuse to buy more bags of orcs from the Tinkhali Emporium, really. Really looking forward to it. It's been a while since I've done a DMing session and a new game and new players, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. For this week's Top 10, I am counting down my top 10 movies based on a comic book. I banned myself from having too many Marvel Cinematic Universe movies on the list. There are some, but let's just say for the record that I love them all, and at some point I'll do a list of my just top 10 MCU movies. This is by no means a definitive list, and the ordering came down to a matter of a number of different factors. How much I love the movie, how good the adaptation is, how much childhood nostalgia I have for it, and since I thought my head was going to explode trying to come up with a limit of just 10 movies, how to really be cruel with myself and not allow double-ups on numbers, as in my official lists, because I do keep them, because I am that sad, I do have double-up numbers. We'll go in reverse order, as usual, because it's fun for me that way. Number 10 is Blade, released in 1998. They don't come much better in terms of successful adaptations than the movie Blade, and kind of sort of its sequels, but let's forget about them for now. Blade is based on the Marvel comic character of the same name. The character first appeared as a supporting character in a 1973 issue of Tomb of Dracula, and very early on writers realised that he would easily overshadow existing characters. So with that in mind, they held him back for periods of time so that they could develop the character, and his first solo appearance came in the horror comic Vampire Tales in 1974. And then he bounced around a series of other titles as a supporting character, from Ghost Rider to Night Stalkers, and it wasn't until 1994 that his own comic debuted with Blade the Vampire Hunter. The comic Blade used teakwood knives and was much more the everyman in his behaviour and attitude. Though, like courageous and brave, he displayed flaws as well, such as an inability to get along with other certain supporting cast members and a hatred of vampires that actually bordered on fanaticism. He was also English instead of American. I mean, why do you never get mad about the cultural appropriation of English characters being turned into American ones, Tumblr? I'd really like to see that for a change. The character originally wasn't a daywalker, but a human being who was immune to being turned into a vampire. Lacking the supernatural speed and strength of actual undead, he relied solely on wits and skills until he was bitten by the character Morbius. The film portrayal of Blade was updated for a 1990s audience, and the comics character was subsequently modified to match. The film's version of Deacon Frost also differs greatly from his comic counterpart. Although the movie retains Frost's upstart ambitions, he was a great deal younger and more updated for the 1990s. Generally, the first Blade movie in the trilogy is best received, but Blade 2 is directed by one of my favourite all-time directors, Guillermo del Toro, and stars Danny John Jules, which firmly places it in the win category for me. The character was popular enough to create a TV series off the back of the movies, which was regarded as terrible, and an anime series, and since the rights have now reverted back to Marvel, another movie is currently being scripted, although it's currently unknown if it's going to be part of the MCU. Blade nearly contained Stan Lee's most disturbing cameo. One was filmed in which he played a policeman who arrives at the Blood Club during the aftermath and finds Quinn's body on fire. I really don't think that we needed to see poor little old Stan Lee being that disturbed, so I'm pretty glad it was cut. What I'm going to play to represent Blade is the Blood Rave techno song from the movie, and this was all over the place at the time, I remember. That was the Blade techno rave song, and number 9 is Hellboy, released in 2004. This movie was made by one of my favourite directors of all time, Guillermo del Toro, and was loosely based on the Dark Horse graphic novel, Hellboy Seed of Destruction. Seed of Destruction was the first Hellboy comic miniseries published by Dark Horse. DC apparently loved the concept, but wussed out because they didn't want to involve the word hell. It was conceived and illustrated by Mike Mignola and scripted by John Byrne. For years it had been Del Toro's dream project, and after the success of Blade 2, the studio offered him a choice of directing Blade 3 or Hellboy, and he briefly considered both but opted to do Hellboy. I assume it was partly because he had killed off Ron Perlman's character in Blade 2, and he really wanted to work his bromance more with him and cast him as Hellboy. Dark Horse is one of those comic publishing houses that tends to be forgotten alongside the big hitters of Marvel and DC, as their books tend to be, well, darker. Their movies also tend to be hit and miss, and some of them you might not even realise were based on a comic. Mystery Men, R.A.P.D., Time Cop, The Mask, to name just a few. And The Mask is something we will discuss in length another day, because I could just do a whole show on The Mask alone. What I'm going to play to represent Hellboy is Can't Smile Without You, which is actually from Hellboy 2, but if anyone takes issue with that, I don't care. That was Can't Smile Without You. And number 8 is Tank Girl, which was released in 1995. Tank Girl is one of those movies that people will either love or they will hate, and I love it. It's one of the very few female-led comic book movies that doesn't suck, and most of them suck. Because it seems that once a girl is in like a boy fetish costume, they tend to forget that she's also a person and not a bouncy sexy times fantasy. The character comes from a British comic and it's set in Australia, which is admittedly somewhat different from the film version. Here's the thing though, I honestly probably wouldn't have gone near the comics if it hadn't been for my extreme love of the movie, and I love, love, love this movie. When you're a little girl and it's the 90s and you love superheroes, there wasn't much in terms of cool female characters to look up to. Tank Girl gave us a character who literally didn't give a sausage. She doesn't let anything stop her or slow her down. She keeps going through the whole movie, not letting anyone or anything get in her way or break her. That's not the only basis of its appeal, though. The movie's just fun. It's fun and it's colourful and it's different, and there's not much out there like Tank Girl. Not before, not since. And every time I sit down and watch it, I have a complete blast. So here is the Joan Jett version of Let's Do It from the ending credits of the movie. Number 7 is Red Sonja, which was released in 1985. Now, I know that most people hate the movie version of Red Sonja, and I don't care. I love it. Again, this was one of the rare female heroic figures that I could look up to as a little kid, and obviously I didn't get a lot of the rapey things that were going on in the movie. They kind of went over my head. All I knew was that Red Sonja was a badass, sword-wielding, bottom-kicking lady, and you can imagine my excitement as I got older and I discovered that it was actually based on a comic book that I could read as well. Recently, the goddess of comic books, Gail Simone, has taken over as the head writer of Red Sonja, and it really has entered a new golden age. I highly recommend starting with hers if you want to get into the books. Other runs I'd recommend are Wrath of the Gods and Revenge of the Gods, and you can get the collected editions pretty easily from either Comixology or Amazon. Red Sonja is loosely based on a character called Red Sonja of Rogatino, who appeared in Robert E. Howard's 1934 short story, The Shadow of the Vulture. It's rumoured he based the character on Sonia Green, a friend of his and one-time wife of H.P. Lovecraft. In 1973, Roy Thomas adapted The Shadow of the Vulture as a canon barbarian story, and partly on a historical swordswoman from the 16th century France called Dark Agnes de Chastillon. So he combined these characters together and then wrote it into a canon story for Conan. In Conan, Sadal de Bergman played Valeria, in the Conan the movie, and a thief who was the love of Conan's life. And Bergman turned down the offer of playing Red Sonja when she was offered it, but she chose to play the villainous Queen Gedrin instead, which I think worked out best because Gedrin is a deliciously evil villain and one of my personal favourite villains of all time. Over the years, there's been much talk of a remake. Robert Rodriguez and his production company, Troublemaker Studios, were talking about doing a version with Rose McGowan is the titular character, but it fell through as their relationship broke up, and so did the production. I'm not opposed to the idea of a remake. I'm quite for the idea of a remake, but just the idea of one of the barbarian warriors is played by a stick insect isn't quite what I had in mind. Gwendolyn Christie would be perfect, and I'm not just saying that because I have a huge girl crush on her. She would be perfect. She plays Brienne of Tarth in Game of Thrones, and she would be absolutely brilliant as Red Sonja. The song I'm going to play is representing Calidor's theme, and it's Arnold Schwarzenegger's character in the movie, and it's sort of a Conan XP because there was a rights issue, but here we go. And that was Calidor's theme from Red Sonja. So, number 6 is Howard the Duck, which was released in 1986. And Howard the Duck is a movie with a really, really bad reputation, and I love the movie. Maybe it's nostalgia goggles, because I know people take issue with the comic to film translation, though happily one of the major problems was that they had to change the design of Howard because he looked too much like Donald Duck, and that's now over because Marvel's owned by Disney, and Disney like money. Disney like money a whole bunch. So I don't think there's going to be any more rights issues to do with Howard's image anymore. But yeah, I really love that film, and I've made people watch it, and they've looked at me like, what are you talking about? But I love it. Anyone who hasn't seen Guardians of the Galaxy yet, shame on you. And I'm going to present a spoiler. Howard makes his triumphant return in Guardians, and I was probably the only person in the cinema squealing out loud when he appeared in the first time I saw it. I did go to see it 6 times, to be fair, and I think that I was that loud I may have permanently damaged my bestie's ears as he was sat next to me at the time. Howard the Duck began life in 1973 in a title called Adventure into Fear as a secondary character in that comic's Man-Thing feature. And eventually he gained his own feature in Giant-Sized Man-Thing alongside characters like Man-Frog and Bessie the Vampiric Hell Cow, before acquiring his own comic book title in 1976. The movie is one I've always loved. It's not a guilty pleasure. I feel no shame in loving this movie. So please now enjoy the Howard the Duck theme tune. That was Howard the Duck. So just before we do number 5, just want to say if you want to call in, the studio number's 01642 645 827. If you have any comments or queries, you can contact me at Airtime Geek on Twitter or at Airtime of the Geek on Instagram. So, number 5 is The Amazing Spider-Man, which was released in 2012. Every year I do a top 10 of my best and worst movies, and the only reason this one didn't take the top spot in 2012 is because 2012 was an epic year in movies and nothing was going to beat Avengers Assemble. Obviously, most people are aware that Spider-Man is a comic book. He first appeared in Amazing Fantasy in 1962 and has been one of the most recognisable and enduring Marvel characters. Spider-Man was my first love. I love the 60s cartoon and the live-action show. I fell in love with the comic books, reading them avidly. I, of course, heard about the new Spider-Man movie from the letters page in the days before the internet, and it was 12 years after the first proposed new Spider-Man movie was released, and that was the Sam Raimi film, and I utterly and completely hated it. I could not stand Tobey Maguire. I'm sure he's a lovely man in real life, but I hated everything about his portrayal of Peter Parker. There are only 2 things about the movie that I like. One is Macho Man Randy Savage.
Ooh, yeah, dig it.
And the other one is J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson. This I approve of. He was perf. They even said if JJ was going to appear in the Amazing movies that they would rehire J.K. Simmons because he was so good at the role. My hatred for the Sam Raimi movie put me off seeing Spider-Man 2 for years. And when I did see it, I thought it was pretty good. The same cannot be said for Spider-Man 3. And in fact, the less said about Spider-Man 3, the better. My bestie told me that he was actually dreading going to see Amazing Spider-Man with me, as he knew how much I hated the Sam Raimi films and what a huge Spider-Man fan I am. But I loved the movie. I absolutely loved it. Andrew Garfield was wonderfully cast. I don't know what people don't like about the second one. I really enjoyed it. Me and the bestie were looking around gleefully at people because we knew what was going to happen with Gwen Stacy. We've read the comics. And we were looking around at people's faces in anticipation of looking at what people's faces were going to be like. I'm really disappointed that when Spider-Man is going to join the MCU, it'll be Peter Parker. And they've recast with Tom Holland, who I'm sure is a fine actor, but I was really hoping that they were going to make it Miles Morales instead. We've had 11 interpretations of the 616 Peter Parker, and the Ultimate Universe as Miles is somewhat different. My main hope, of course, is eventually Jessica Drew, Spider-Woman, will turn up in the MCU because she's a great member of the Avengers, and she's kicked Spidey's bottom more than once. So for your enjoyment, here is the Michael Bublé cover of Amazing Spider-Man. I told you last week it was a classic that just gets updated, so here is one of those updates. Number 4 is The Crow, which was released in 1994, and I can't talk about The Crow without talking about Brandon Lee. It would be impossible, and it would be completely unjust. But I'll briefly talk about the original comic first. The Crow was written by J.O. Barr as a means of dealing with the death of his girlfriend thanks to a drunk driver. It started life as a short story called Spooky Codeine and the Dead Man, which I read in a compilation edited by J.O. Barr called The Crow, Shattered Lives and Broken Dreams. I believe it's out of print now, but you can get a second-hand copy. If you're a fan of The Crow, it's a really great collection, and I found it very enjoyable to read, and there's just some great fan art in there as well. The original comic is, and the short story as well, is very dark. There's no way around it. It's dark, it's penetrating, and it's disturbing. And the older I've got, the more disturbing and frightening I've found it to be. Some things you can read or watch for pure entertainment and just get on with your life and never give it a second thought. And The Crow left a shadow inside me that's followed me around through life, and it's always been there in the background of my mind. The themes, love, death, tragedy, it becomes more real to me as each year's passed me by. When I first stumbled across The Crow, I was no older than 11 or 12, so as I've gotten older, I've found it much easier to understand the themes and how deeply scarring these things that happen to the characters are. I was probably far too young to watch it when I very first saw it, to be honest, with how dark and disturbing some of it is, but I was sort of naive enough for it most of it to go over my head. The star of the movie, Brandon Lee, of course, famously died during its production. This was affected everything about the movie and the people who made it. Several of the cast members were so traumatised they ceased acting either altogether or for really long periods of time. Joe Barr himself, in interviews for many years, said that he wished he'd never written the book, as without it Brandon wouldn't have died, and the tool he used for coping with a very painful death gave him a fresh pain in like the death of his close friend, and it was obvious that he placed blame on himself in some of those really painful interviews that I saw with him. Of course, in recent years he's returned to writing and even written sequels to the original graphic novel, but the ghost of Brandon Lee certainly hung over his head for many years. The Crow is one of my favourite movies of all time, not just as a comic book movie. It's a rare thing that I think it's a near perfect movie. In terms of love, I find it more beloved than some of the movies that I've placed above it on this list, but I'm using other factors, and that's why it's taking the number 4 slot. So please enjoy the main theme from The Crow, Burn by The Cure. Before we go into the top 3, we're just going to recap our Ignition Radio weekly competition. You can win £10 worth of food vouchers to spend at the Six Meadows pub in Middlesbrough, right near the Borough Stadium, or the Voyager in Gisborough, or the Mike Arms in Ingleby. All you have to do is contact the studio by either calling us on 01642 645 827 and giving us your name, mobile number and email address, or you can do it alternatively through our website by clicking the Contact Us button. So, number 3 is Deadpool, which was released this year, 2016. Obviously, this is a newcomer to my list. It bumped Supergirl off, sorry Cara. And since I reviewed the movie just a couple of weeks ago, I'll briefly talk about the comics. He first appeared in an issue of New Mutants in 1991, which practically makes him a baby in terms of comics. Rob Liefeld is generally given the credit for creating him. However, this is not really technically true. He created the image of Deadpool, and he created his name. And he had very little to do with the development of the character we know and love today. It was actually his writing partner who sort of took a look at him and said, "Oh, this really reminds me of Deathstroke from Teen Titans." And that's how I first came across Deadpool. I was reading an article about the Teen Titans and reading about the Met with a Mouth and how the parody was of Deathstroke, whose name is Slade Wilson. And the writer gave him the name of Wade Wilson. At the time, I'd long given up on X-Men titles because of how complicated and convoluted the whole X-Men stuff had become. Even as a lifelong comic reader, I needed like a cheat sheet to get me to figure out what the earth was going on at the time. So I totally missed out on the early foray into comics. But I sort of started reading about the character, I thought, oh, this is really interesting. So I picked up a few collected issues, totally fell in love, and really, really enjoyed the movie when that came out. But just remember what Captain America says, stay away from Deadpool. He's not for kids. Number 2 is Guardians of the Galaxy, which was released in 2014. The new incarnation of Guardians actually only hit the shelves in 2008, which practically makes them newborns, and indeed many of my comic reading friends hadn't even heard of the title when it was announced as a movie. Obviously, I immediately bought all the Guardians titles published when it was announced and read them all. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, I didn't read any of the comics until after I'd seen the movie, because it was a rare thing for me to have a comic, especially a Marvel title that I didn't really know much about, and I kind of just wanted to go in with fresh eyes for a change and not judge it on the comic merits. And Guardians of the Galaxy turned out to be one of those absolutely rare, perfect movies. Most people watching it wouldn't have read the comics beforehand or heard of the characters, but it really proved that you didn't have to in order to enjoy the movie. Sony Studios have been hanging on to some of the bigger hitter Marvel names for years, like Spider-Man and Fantastic Four and X-Men. So when they started building the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they were forced to go with characters that had been largely unfamiliar to the wider non-comic reading public. And the patience to build their world and characters and history has taken them 11 years, 12 movies, 4 TV shows, and it just keeps growing. DC just wants money. So it's throwing a bunch of characters together in grey costumes and hoping that enough people will pay to go and see it. It really makes me nostalgic for the old days of DC movies that were a little bit fun and had colour. I mean, not Joel Schumacher colour, but just, not everything grey. So I enjoy Awesome Mix Volume 1, Hooked on a Feeling. And number 1, we have reached there at last, is Avengers Assemble, which was released in 2012. Not only is this my favourite comic book movie, but it's my overall 4th favourite movie of all time. And I could gush for hours and hours about how good it is and how much I loved it. I went to see it at the cinema 12 times, so I literally could talk you through the film word for word. It was just called The Avengers around the world, but Assemble was entered in the UK to differentiate between the classic Avengers TV series, which probably no one going to see this movie remembers. It took over 1.5 billion worldwide at the cinemas. That's billion with a B. It broke 11 box office records, and I honestly probably couldn't tell you anything about the plot of the movie that you don't already know, because who didn't go to see Avengers Assemble? So I'm going to tell you some fun trivia facts instead. Robert Downey Jr. apparently likes hiding things on movie sets, and on the set for Zodiac, a film he made with Hulk actor Mark Ruffalo, he decided to hide jars of urine as a protest to filming because he was actually a 12-year-old. On the set of Avengers, he hid food. So much food that the crew actually stopped trying to find it, and so the scenes aboard the helicarrier where Tony's eating and offering out blueberries was actually just Robert Downey Jr. being hungry and offering out blueberries while he's acting. Also, because Robert Downey Jr. isn't all that tall, all his scenes with Gwyneth Paltrow had her barefoot and him wearing what the fans have dubbed Tony's hooker heels. They're 3 to 4 inch platform shoes he has to wear when filming with taller actors such as 6-foot plus Chris Evans, so that he appears to be roughly the same height as him, even though Robert Downey Jr. is only about 5'9". Director Joss Whedon had earlier been considered to direct the X-Men film in the 90s, and he was a big fan of X-Men and even wrote a script from which only 2 lines made it into the film, which I can't repeat because they contain a swear. But the scenes in the Statue of Liberty, and it takes place between Cyclops and Wolverine towards the end of the movie. It's just after they're trying to prove whether or not Wolverine is Mystique. You'd recognise Joss's writing once you hear it. At one point during shooting Avengers Assemble, Tom Hiddleston, who plays Loki, stole Captain America's shield and Thor's hammer and sent a picture of himself to Chris Evans and Chris Helmsworth with a claim that he wasn't planning on returning them, although obviously he eventually did. And speaking of Loki, there's a fan theory that when Loki attacks the Earth, he's under the mind control from Thanos, due to the fact that Loki and Tom Hiddleston both have green eyes, and in Avengers Assemble they're noticeably blue, like those Loki has under his spell with the scepter. This remains unconfirmed, and it's probably a little bit shady, as does the theory that Loki's actual final plan involved him getting caught and returned to Asgard in order to steal the Infinity Gauntlet locked away in Asgard for Thanos the Mad Titan, which Thanos actually takes. In the stinger for Avengers Age of Ultron, we see Thanos breaking into the vault in Asgard and stealing the Infinity Gauntlet, so perhaps that's not so far-fetched and that one could end up being proved. So for your enjoyment, here is Shoot to Thrill. So that was my top 10 movies based on a comic book. I've just been told our emails should be working again. So if you'd like to send in any comments, queries, suggestions for future lists, you can email me, paulab@ignitionradio.co.uk. Alternatively, you can call in the studio, 01642 645 827. You can also get in touch with me through Twitter. It's at Airtime Geek, or you can follow me on Instagram at Airtime of the Geek. So I've been working a lot this past week and I didn't get a chance to watch something new, so I'm going to review something old. The unholy trinity of doody mongers, usually with a sweary version of doody, is how myself and my bestie describe the directors Michael Bay, Christopher Nolan and J.J. Abrams. I want to make this like a thing, so I'm going to mention it a lot from now on. 10 Cloverfield Lane is out in a few days, and apparently it's a sequel to Cloverfield, but it's not a sequel to Cloverfield. J.J. Abrams, part of the Unholy Trinity, who describes it as not a literal sequel, but a blood relative or a spiritual successor, which is a big pile of poopy-flavoured lies, as he's blatantly called it that so people will go to pay it and see it under the assumption it is a sequel to Cloverfield. A spiritual successor should be a film that's similar in feel. Like, Darren Aronofsky's masterpiece, The Black Swan, is a spiritual successor to The Wrestler, but it isn't called The Wrestling Ballerina. And what Abrams has done is a bit similar to taking Galaxy Quest and calling it Number 9 Star Trek Avenue. Galaxy Quest was once voted as a more popular Star Trek movie than Star Trek V. This is the movie that all fans like to pretend doesn't exist. But whilst it feels like a movie made about and for Star Trek fans, it's not masquerading as something it isn't. And I've been burned by movie trailers like this before. Which brings me to my review of the day, case in point, Prometheus. When I found out that Ridley Scott was returning to the Aliens franchise 30 years after the original 1979 movie, I could hardly contain my fan squee. After all, I loved the Aliens movies for years, and on the commentary track for the director's cut, Aliens, Scott talked in length about how he wanted to make a movie which answered questions about the Xenos. There's a whole section where he talks on and on and on about this, and some of the things he says were, what purpose were they made for? Who designed them? How did they end up on LV-426? The sci-fi masterpiece has long been a favourite of mine, so of course I made sure that I had tickets to the midnight screening, and it was first at the front of the queue an hour before the film was due to start. Expectations were high. I didn't expect to see any xenomorphs, as Ridley Scott had already quashed that in pre-release interviews, but I did expect horror and perhaps some of those questions being answered. So the phrase, I am disappointed, has never quite been so apt for me, as I sit here remembering seeing this movie and feeling so deflated and poorer for the experience. There were some quite epic scenes in the movie, all of which were in the trailer. The other 2.5 hours, mostly filler, with superfluous characters who pad out the film and contribute nothing to the plot. The film answers about maybe 2 questions about the franchise and raises 50 new ones. Michael Fassbender is wasted. Wasted. His character's the only interesting one and pretty much the only one who seems to push the plot forward. And he's a brilliant actor, and I loved him in every single movie I've seen him in, even if that movie sucked, like Frank, which was a really super weird movie. There were 1 or 2 little nice character moments scattered through the debris, but they were completely overshadowed by confusing character decisions and out-of-nowhere plot developments. The nod to the franchise and the new design work from H.R. Geiger gave me a few scream moments, and had this movie contained absolutely no connection to the Aliens franchise, with some minor plot changes, it could have been a really epic sci-fi adventure, but as it stands, it falls flat and it completely failed to excite me. If you've seen the trailer, you've seen all the interesting parts of the movie. There are a few threads which really fascinated me and I wanted to know more about, but they're dropped so quickly and they're never introduced and spoken of again. The beauty of Alien was in its simplicity. It was a monster, it was a ship, small crew, horror ensues. Prometheus seemed to be tripping over itself to introduce wild ideas and bizarre technologies, but didn't seem to want to develop or explain anything once it was introduced. It seemed it was very much riding the coattails of, hey look, Ridley Scott's back in the Alien franchise. I mean, half the technology in the movie seemed so new, and in Alien, which is set quite far in the future, they made it sort of grody and dirty looking and grotty, and everything was sort of old and clapped out, so I'm really failing to see how these two worlds connect technology-wise. The movie opens with an engineer or space jockey preparing to seed a primordial planet, which we can probably assume is Earth, with life, and he does this by drinking some black gooey stuff, which causes him to die in pain, disintegrating at the cellular level, which looks cool, but made me wonder, is this really the best way for this incredibly advanced alien species to introduce genetic material to a planet? It's a little like finding out that Prometheus brought fire to humanity by setting himself on fire, despite the readily available of kindling. And with many other bizarre moments in this movie, it makes sense at a thematic and allegorical level, but fails at the level of basic plot. A big chunk of this tedious exposition is delivered by a hologram of CEO Peter Wayland, who is inexplicably played by Guy Pearce in bad latex makeup rather than an actual old person. I mean, Guy Pearce played the younger version in the pre-movie trailers, but no version of the character when he's young is actually in the movie. And it's not like Guy Pearce is known for being a groundbreaking actor, so why? Why did it have to be Guy Pearce? Wayland claims he will have died by the time they see this recording, which is a great big fat lie, since Wayland plans involve him being revived once they've made contact with the aliens. He must know that this will be exposed as a deception within a day or two at the most, making the whole elaborate ruse completely pointless, except as a setup for a third act reveal, which surprises no one. Ditto the fact that Charlize Theron is Wayland's daughter. This is kept secret for absolutely no reason beyond setting up a meh-inducing late reveal. Her motives are even more obscure. She believes the entire mission is just a hazardous wild goose chase and only wants to inherit her father's empire. So she joins them on this 4-year-plus mission because she doesn't want to hang around squabbling over who runs the company, even though her best-case scenario would appear to involve doing this. You know, when she gets back from the perilous mission, having given 5 years for her rivals to scheme in her absence, but seeing as how she didn't figure out how to run sideways, I think it probably worked out best for Wayland-Yutani that she ended up getting crushed by that giant ship. Wayland's main motivation, we finally find out, is that he hopes that the aliens have some mean of prolonging his life. He's already hit the limits in terms of artificial extension and is near death. Except he can apparently remain alive in cryostasis indefinitely. So instead of spending $1 trillion on medical research while staying in stasis, he decides to go on a snipe hunt instead. And when the crew get to LV426, The team bust out some incredibly sophisticated mapping probes, and instead of perhaps waiting for these mapping probes to finish mapping the area that they're going to be exploring, they just stroll on in, and then they found out there's oxygen, and the character of Holloway pulls off his helmet, telling his colleagues not to be a skeptic because apparently skepticism is bad for scientists. They have no way the air isn't knowing that the air isn't full of bacteria, and everyone else points out that this is insane, but the rest of the team almost immediately follow suit when it doesn't result in Holloway's instant death. The biologist and geologist freak out at the sight of alien bodies, despite having been willing to trek 35 light years on a perilous exploratory mission, and hasten to head back to the ship in panic. They get lost, despite the fact that the geologist is the one with the mapping expertise, and this fear evaporates as quickly as it appeared, as the biologist decides he should recklessly cozy up to a terrifying alien serpent creature. To nobody's surprise, it kills the biologist, while his geologist colleague is dissolved in black gooey stuff, only to later reappear as a zombie in a completely pointless fight scene. And this is a pattern in the movie. In almost every scene, members of this hand-picked group of top scientists for $1 trillion mission routinely make this kind of wildly irrational blunder that we strain to accept when it's half-drunk teenagers in a slasher film. Apparently also, the DNA of the alien engineers is a perfect match for human DNA. This is despite the fact that they're 8 feet tall, with skin like a Greek marble statue, no body hair, black eyes, and the fact that humans interbred with Neanderthals a lot way back when. Apparently, despite all of that, still absolutely 100% identical DNA. With half the team out exploring the hazardous alien facility, Space Captain Stringer Bell decides to abandon his cause to have sexy times with Charlize Theron, which at some level, okay, fair play, but no one ever suggests that this is a gross dereliction of duty. The ending of Prometheus is definitely the worst part about the film. It's so muddled, and somehow David, played by Michael Fassbender, knows that the annoyed engineer is coming to find Shaw. We don't know how he knows this, but he decides to be nice and warn her. You think this is going to lead to a long cat-and-mouse chase sequence between the engineer and Shaw, but as soon as the engineer smashes his way into the room, Shaw presses a button and the engineer is attacked by the face-hugger thing. There's no tension, there's no build-up, there's no logic. And then Shaw decides that instead of going back to Earth, she's going to take David's head and one of the alien ships and find more of these engineers that tried to kill her and get answers. What will she be eating on this trip? Do they have a toilet on the ship? Perhaps she will enter hypersleep, but is there a pod that she can use on this ship? Is it configured for a human being? And can she trust David? Because he's been so trustworthy so far. None of these questions will likely be answered in the sequel, which is apparently now called Alien Covenant, and will probably make as much sense as Prometheus did, which is none. So that's it for this week. Tune in next week for another Airtime of the Geek. If you'd like to comment, query, or make any suggestions, you can contact me, Paula B, at ignitionradio.co.uk. You can also get in touch with me from Twitter at AirtimeGeek, or you can follow me on Instagram at AirtimeOfTheGeek. And I'm going to be playing a bit of music until Simon comes in this afternoon, so enjoy that.